My husband filed for divorce at 9:12 in the morning. 6 minutes later, a request to transfer his founder shares was already in the system. 6 minutes. That's not enough time to improvise something like that. So I called my lawyer. I expected her to file a restraint motion. Instead, she asked for one document I hadn't even thought about, the draft timestamp. That single request changed everything I thought I was looking at. Because what came back wasn't a 6-minute story, it was an 11-day one. You'll probably decide fast whether this was panic or whether it was a plan that had been running for a while. Stay until the end, because I was wrong about which one it was, and winning didn't feel like winning at all.
Seraphine picked up on the second ring. She always does. I've called her 4 times in 9 years of marriage. 4 times I thought I was overreacting, and 4 times she told me in that voice of hers whether I was right or not. This was the 5th, and for the first time, I didn't have to ask. I told her about the timestamps, 9:12, 9:18. I told her about the compliance flag, the holding entity I didn't recognize, the transfer request for Crispin's 11% voting block. I gave her the sequence in order, the way I give everything. Clean, precise, no editorializing. That's how I was trained to present. That's how I survived boardrooms. Seraphine listened without interrupting. That's how I know she's already thinking ahead of me. Then she said, "Mireille, the draft timestamp. I need it." Not the submission timestamp, not the filing time. The draft, the moment the transfer request was actually written, not when it was sent. I went quiet. I want to be honest about that. I went quiet because I'd been looking at the wrong clock. The compliance system flagged the submission. I'd been working the 6-minute gap between filing and submission, like that gap was the story. Seraphine heard the same facts I gave her and immediately asked for an earlier timestamp I hadn't thought to pull. Look, I've worked beside smart people my whole career. I know the difference between smart and sharp. Seraphine is sharp, the kind of sharp that reads a document set and asks for the one that isn't there yet. I wrote it down anyway, draft timestamp, even though I wasn't sure what it would show. That's a habit from years of building things with Crispin. You write down what the other person asks for before you decide whether it matters. I kept a lot of habits from that marriage. That's the only one that saved me anything. And I need the shareholder covenant, the full document. I knew the covenant. I helped build the governance structure it sat inside 7 years ago when Lau Meridian was still finding its public footing, and we needed rules that would hold the ownership structure together if things ever got complicated. I didn't draft the covenant's specific language. That was working group work. Lawyers, advisors, a small group of executives who understood what founder-class shares meant in governance context. What I did not know, what I wouldn't know until the next morning, was that Crispin was in that working group, that his initials were in the margin of the specific clause that now applied to the transfer he just attempted. But Seraphine was already asking for it, which means she read the situation and went straight to the document most likely to catch him. That's either instinct or experience. With Seraphine, it's both. I ended the call and sat with the 2 documents on my desk for a moment, the divorce petition on the left, the transfer request on the right, 3 inches of walnut between them. 9 years. That's how long we'd been building something together, Crispin and I, the company, the governance structure, the marriage that held it all in place. And somewhere in those 9 years, he'd been watching a different clock than I was. I picked up my pen. I didn't write anything. I just held it. The access log came through 40 minutes later. 40 minutes, I want you to understand what I did during those 40 minutes. I didn't pace. I didn't call anyone. I sat at my desk and I read every piece of public documentation I could find on the holding entity named in the transfer request. Registration date, jurisdiction, beneficial ownership filings, the kind of background check you run in 20 minutes when you're trying to decide if a counterparty is real. The holding entity was real. Incorporated cleanly, structured correctly, the kind of holding vehicle that exists to receive assets without leaving fingerprints on the transaction. Professional, not improvised. The log opened on my screen. I read it the way I read everything, bottom up, because the submission timestamp was at the bottom and I already knew the submission timestamp. What I needed was what was above it. Draft creation, 0847. The divorce was filed at 9:12. The transfer request was drafted at 8:47, 25 minutes before the filing. He didn't write the transfer after the divorce was filed. He wrote it before he filed. He drafted the transfer, filed the divorce, and then submitted the transfer. In that order. The 6-minute gap between filing and submission wasn't the window he was racing against. It was the gap he'd calculated would be enough. This is the part I have to say plainly because if I dress it up, it sounds like a legal argument, and it isn't. It's simpler than that. The divorce filing wasn't the end of something he'd decided. It was a mechanism. He needed to file in order to trigger a sequence, and he had the transfer ready before he pulled the trigger. I sat with that for exactly as long as I needed to, which wasn't long. I've spent 9 years learning to process information at the speed the room requires. The room required fast. What I couldn't process as quickly, and I'm being honest here, was the marriage part, not the legal part. The marriage. The specific understanding that somewhere in the last 9 years, Crispin had been operating on a timeline I didn't have access to. Not a secret affair, not a hidden account, nothing I'd been trained to look for. A calendar, a sequence, a plan that treated our marriage as one of its components. I used to think we built this company the same way, together. Same blueprint, same timeline, same understanding of where we were going. The draft timestamp said otherwise. I forwarded the log to Seraphine with 3 words. Request investor communications. Not a question, not a consultation. She told me the previous night that if the draft predated the filing, the next document we needed was proof of when contact with the buyer began. I was telling her we'd crossed that threshold. She'd know what to do. That request, 3 words, sent from my executive office at 10:03 a.m. on a Tuesday, was the moment I stopped managing a compliance issue and started building a case. There's a difference. I want to make sure you understand the difference. Managing a compliance issue means you flag an anomaly and let the system resolve it. Building a case means you've decided the anomaly is evidence of intent, and intent is a different fight entirely. He planned this. The draft timestamp proved the planning. What it didn't yet tell me was how far back the plan went. How many days before the filing had he been in contact with the buyer? How long had the holding entity been ready to receive the shares? I didn't have those answers at 10:03. Dry. I've sat across tables with enough people who thought they'd hidden the beginning of something to know the beginning is always the most expensive part to find, but it's always there. I closed the log. I picked up the covenant folder Seraphine had asked for separately and set it beside the 2 documents that were still on my desk. 3 documents now. The petition, the transfer request, and the covenant he'd helped write 7 years ago, whose language I was only beginning to understand applied to exactly what he'd just attempted. I didn't touch any of them. I looked at all 3 and I thought, he built a very precise machine, and somewhere in the building of it, he forgot that I read the same kind of blueprints he does. I photographed both documents before I left my office. Force of habit. You document what you have before you go somewhere that might change it. I was in Seraphine's review room by early afternoon. Seraphine Ilias, my outside counsel, was already at the table when I arrived. The folio she carries everywhere was open. The covenant was in front of her, bound and tabbed. She'd been through it before I got there. The tabs told me that. She didn't wait. She opened to the first tab and read the clause aloud, not because I couldn't read it myself, because she wanted the room to hear it in sequence, in her voice, so there was no ambiguity about what it said. The clause governed founder class voting share transfers, board notification required, a cooling period, 30 days minimum, before any vote-controlling block could move, full disclosure of the proposed transferee's governance intentions reviewed by a qualified independent committee. These were not boilerplate conditions. They were written specifically for a company like Leal Meridian, a public company with a concentrated founder class structure, where a single block of 11% could shift operational control without triggering a formal majority. The clause was written, in other words, to prevent exactly what Crispin had submitted at 9:18 that morning. Seraphine Ilias closed the covenant to the cover page. Then she opened the folio and removed a second document, thinner, stapled, a drafting record from the working group sessions 7 years ago. She placed it on the table and slid it toward me without a word. I looked at the margin of the relevant page. CD, blue ballpoint, 3 millimeters tall. His handwriting. I've seen it on enough documents to know the specific way he forms a capital C, the way the D closes without quite touching the C's tail. He was in the working group. He sat in the sessions where this clause was built. He put his initials in the margin to signal he'd reviewed this language and found it acceptable. In my experience, the people who write governance rules always assume the rules are for everyone else. I'd watched Crispin enforce covenant language against 2 other executives in the years since this document was drafted. Both times, he cited it with the confidence of someone who'd never imagined being on the receiving end of it. I reached for the pen in my jacket pocket, the instinct I can't seem to unlearn, and stopped. There was nothing to write down. The document said everything. His initials said the rest. Seraphine watched me read it. She didn't say, "I told you so." She doesn't do that. What she said was, "The disclosure request went out at noon. We'll have counsel's response by end of business." She was already in the next move. I was still sitting with his handwriting. His lawyer's response came in at 12:43. Seraphine had sent the formal disclosure request at noon. 43 minutes. I want you to understand what 43 minutes means in legal response time. An objection to a disclosure request isn't a form letter. It requires a lawyer to read the request, assess its scope, identify the grounds for objection, draft language that holds under compulsion, and review it before sending. 43 minutes from a firm that didn't know the request was coming. That's not fast. That's pre-written. We were in Seraphine's private office by then, a smaller room off the review room, 2 chairs, her desk, the worn folio open between us. She read the objection without expression, then she set it down. He was watching for this request, she said. Not a question, a conclusion, and she was right. Because the objection didn't argue that the disclosure was improper. It argued scope. It tried to narrow the window of communications being requested from 30 days to 7. 7 days? Which would have placed the start of the disclosure window 2 days before the filing date and left the earlier communications, the ones we needed, outside the compelled range. He drafted an objection designed to protect a specific window of time, which meant he knew which window needed protecting. I've sat across enough tables from people who thought they'd hidden the beginning of something to recognize this. You don't argue about the window unless you know what's inside it. Seraphine filed a counter-response in 20 minutes, citing the marital restraint's full 30-day disclosure scope. The compulsion held. The objection failed. The communications would be produced. What I kept coming back to, sitting in that smaller office while Seraphine worked, was the architecture of it. The transfer was prearranged. The draft timestamp proved that. The objection was pre-drafted. The response speed proved that. 2 layers of preparation, both designed to protect a timeline. The transfer had a legal defense built into it before the divorce was even filed. His lawyer's response came in 43 minutes. That's fast enough that you have to ask, did he call his lawyer before or after he submitted the transfer? I think by that point I already knew the answer. Seraphine looked up from her desk. She said the communications will arrive by late afternoon. She said it the way she says everything, like the outcome is already determined and the only variable is timing. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't, because by then I understood that the communications were going to tell me something I wouldn't be able to unknow, and the question that had been forming since I read the draft timestamp that morning was getting closer to its answer. How far back does this go? The communications arrived at 4:17 p.m. Seraphine read through them in the review room. We'd moved back in there, the table cleaner now, just the folio and the new document set routed from the disclosure. She read the way she reads everything, starting at the beginning, moving forward, no expression until she reached something that required one. She reached it about 4 minutes in. She didn't say anything. She removed a single printed page from the set and placed it on the table in front of me, face up, and slid it across. I read the date first. That's the habit. You read dates before content because dates tell you which frame to use. 11 days before the filing. The content was operational, not preliminary, not exploratory, operational. Transfer structure, the holding entity's receiving mechanism, the governance positioning of the transferred block post-transfer, the timeline for completion contingent on a triggering event that was not named in the message but was described as imminent. Holding entity mechanics, the beneficial ownership chain, the board consent procedure, the margin for regulatory review. The message read the way a project brief reads when the planning is finished and the execution is being confirmed. This is the part I have to say plainly, because every other version of it is a lie I almost believed. He wasn't reacting to the end of the marriage. The end of the marriage was a component. It was listed not by name but by function as the triggering event. The filing was the mechanism that started the sequence. He had built the sequence 11 days earlier and then lived inside the marriage while the sequence waited. We had dinner 10 days before he filed. I remember it specifically because I'd had a difficult board meeting that afternoon, and he cooked, which he did maybe 4 times a year. I remember thinking it was a good evening. I remember being grateful for it. He was 1 day into building a structure designed to move control of our company before our marriage had legally ended, and we had dinner, and I was grateful. I set the message down. Here's the question I haven't been able to answer since that afternoon, and I'm not going to pretend I have. When he decided the marriage was over, was the plan the decision, or did the decision come first and the plan follow? Because those are 2 different things. One of them is a man who made a painful choice and then protected himself. The other is a man who made a business calculation and then scheduled the ending around it. I don't know which one he was. I don't think the document tells me. I think the document only tells me what he did, and what he did is damning enough that the why almost doesn't matter. Almost. 11 days. In those 11 days, I attended 3 executive meetings, signed 2 partnership agreements, and flew to Seattle for a strategy review, all while inside a marriage that was already over by his accounting. We were in some of those meetings together. He voted on the Seattle agenda. I remember him being present, engaged. He is always engaged. The 6-minute gap was never the real interval. It was the last 6 minutes of 11 days, and the filing wasn't the end of something. It was the execution of everything that had already been built. I wasn't in his office that afternoon. What I know of it is from what his counsel disclosed in the review process and from the transfer agent's flag record, which documented the call he made at 4:51 p.m. So this is reconstructed. But I've worked alongside this man for 9 years. I know how he sits in a room when something has gone sideways. And I know the specific question he asks when he's not panicking, he's recalculating. He was in his private office. His counsel was on the line. The transfer request had been flagged by the transfer agent at 9:28 that morning, 10 minutes after submission, as potentially subject to the marital disclosure restraint. The flag didn't reject the request, it suspended it. The request was sitting in the system, neither approved nor denied, waiting for the restraint question to resolve. His counsel told him the communications had been produced under compulsion. He absorbed this without audible reaction. What he asked, and this is in the call record, was, what time did the restraint activate? Not what do we do, not can we challenge the compulsion, just what time? Because his entire architecture was built around a gap, the gap between the filing and the restraint's full activation. He had calculated that gap, structured the transfer to land inside it, and submitted at 9:18 believing the window was still open. What he hadn't accounted for was that the filing itself triggered an immediate disclosure freeze, not the court order that would have followed, but the filing. The machinery moved at the moment of filing, not the moment of judicial action. The restraint activated at 9:12, the same minute he filed. There was no gap. He had been timing his move against a window that had already closed when he opened the door. Here's what I've had to sit with since then. His plan was not irrational. He was correct that the marriage was ending. He was correct that the governance structure needed to reflect that eventually. He prepared meticulously the holding entity, the investor, the covenant language he thought he understood, the legal objection his counsel had ready in 43 minutes. The plan was precise. What it wasn't was his clock to read, and that's the part he hadn't built a contingency for, that someone else was reading the same timestamps, earlier and faster, and with a different question. The transfer request sat flagged on his screen, not moving. The window he'd spent 11 days building had been closed since 9:12 that morning. He'd submitted the transfer 6 minutes after it was already too late. I got there early. I don't know why I'm telling you that, except that it matters. The specific choice to be in the room before he was, to sit down, to put my folder on the table, to look at the documents Seraphine had already arranged down the center of the table in sequence, and to be still with them before anyone else arrived. I needed 60 seconds in that room without him in it. The documents were laid left to right, the investor communication, earliest date on the far left, 11 days before the filing, then the access log with the draft timestamp, then the divorce petition, then the transfer request, and below the row, centered, the covenant open to the tabbed clause, his initials visible in the margin without needing to lean in to read them. I sat across from the empty chair he would take. I was wearing a turtleneck. I remember noticing that because it didn't matter, but I'd stood in front of my closet that morning for longer than usual, and the turtleneck felt like the right answer for reasons I didn't examine too closely. He came in at 9:04 with his counsel. I watched him cross the room toward the table. He looked at the documents. He did not look at me. And then for a half second, maybe less, he didn't sit. He stood. He read the sequence left to right the way a person reads a sentence they weren't expecting to find. His expression did not change, but his hand touched the back of his chair before he pulled it out, and he held the chair for 1 second before he lowered himself into it. That half second, I'd been in rooms with Crispin for 9 years, boardrooms, negotiations, the kind of conversations where both of you know the real agenda and neither of you names it. I know what his composed face looks like. That half second wasn't composed. That was a man reading his own timestamps on a table and finding them arranged in a language he didn't write. Seraphine sat across from his counsel without introducing herself. She opened the folio. She looked at no one in particular, just the documents, and then at the room, and then she began. I folded my hands in my lap, not on the table, in my lap. I don't know when I stopped putting my hands flat on surfaces. Somewhere between day 0 and this morning, the habit left.
Seraphine doesn't argue. That's the first thing I learned about her. Years ago, a different matter, a different room. She assembles, she places, she lets the sequence speak. She placed her index finger on the investor communication at the far left of the table. She said, 11 days before the filing. She didn't look at Crispin when she said it. She looked at the document. She placed the access log beside it, transfer drafted at 8:47 a.m. She placed the divorce petition, filed at 9:12. She placed the transfer request receipt, submitted at 9:18. 4 documents, left to right. 11 days of premeditation visible in 45 minutes of a Tuesday morning. His counsel was writing something on a legal pad. Crispin was looking at the sequence, not at Seraphine, not at me, at the documents themselves, the way you look at something you built when you find it being used against you. Then Seraphine opened the covenant to the tabbed page and placed it below the row, centered, the clause highlighted, his initials in the margin at eye level. She said, he helped write this language 7 years ago. That was all. She closed her hands in front of her and waited. His counsel objected, scope, jurisdiction, timing of restraint activation. 3 distinct arguments, each one technically sound, none of them touching the sequence on the table, because the sequence on the table wasn't an argument. It was a clock, and you can't object to a clock. You can only dispute whose it is. The transfer flag stood, the restraint held. The investor's holding entity would receive nothing. Counsel noted the formal objection for the record. Seraphine noted the formal response. The transfer was flagged as bad faith, premeditated control relocation executed in violation of the shareholder covenant by one of its authors. I watched his counsel set the pen down. Crispin's counsel signed the acknowledgement form. Crispin did not look at the form while it was being signed. He was still looking at the documents, or at the space above the documents. I couldn't tell which. I spent 9 years learning to read the difference between him thinking and him deciding, and in that moment, I couldn't tell the difference. That's the thing I keep coming back to. 9 years, and in the most important room, at the most important moment, I couldn't tell what was happening behind his eyes. Maybe I never could. Maybe that's the confession I've been working around. When Crispin's counsel finished, the room went quiet the way rooms do when everyone has stopped reaching for the next thing to say. Crispin looked at me, not at Seraphine, not at his counsel, not at the documents, at me. And for the first time since 9/12 the previous morning, for the first time since the divorce petition and the compliance flag and the draft timestamp and the investor communication 11 days prior, I was looking directly back at him. He said the marriage was already over. The company shouldn't have to wait for the court to confirm what he already knew. He was moving governance to where it was going anyway, not hiding a transaction, finishing one. I want to tell you I felt rage. It would be cleaner. It would be simpler. What I felt was the specific, terrible clarity of a sentence that almost makes sense, because he wasn't lying. The marriage was ending. I knew that. I'd known it before the filing arrived, in the way you know something you haven't said aloud yet. And the governance would have needed to shift eventually. He was correct about both of those things. He was wrong about one thing.
He believed the clock was his to read. He believed the gap between the filing and the restraint's activation was territory he owned. He believed he could move a company's governance structure the way you move any asset, precisely, quietly, before the other side knows to look. He didn't account for the draft timestamp. He didn't account for Seraphine asking for the one document the system hadn't flagged. And he didn't account for 3 words sent at 10:03 a.m. on a Tuesday. And I didn't account for any of this. That's the part I've sat with. 9 years. I built strategy decks for this company. I read documents from the bottom up because I learned early that the conclusion is always buried. And I didn't read the one that was right in front of me. I called what I was seeing stress or distance or the weight of running a $5.8 billion company beside someone's whose calendar I didn't have access to. I trusted the paper trail to catch him. I didn't think to wonder what he was doing before the paper trail existed. That's not innocence. That's avoidance. And I've been honest about everything else in this room, so I'll be honest about that too. I looked at him across the table, the documents between us, the sequence that Seraphine had assembled, 11 days of premeditation laid out in 45 minutes of a Wednesday morning. I said, you use the filing as a trigger. That's what the logs show, not urgency, a trigger. He didn't answer. The room was very still. Seraphine began gathering her documents. His counsel stood. Crispin stood. He didn't look at me again. He straightened his tie, one small, precise gesture, and he walked out of the room with his counsel, and the door closed behind them, and the room held the sound of that for a moment. And then it was just Seraphine and me, and the documents still on the table. She looked at me. The flag holds, she said. The investor gets nothing. You kept the structure. I nodded. She closed the folio and left. I stayed. The transfer request receipt was still on the table, face up, timestamp visible, 9/18. The document that had started as a compliance flag 36 hours ago, that had become the center of a case, that had been formally labeled bad faith in a room with lawyers and records, was just sitting there on a conference table in a room that had emptied. When did he stop being a husband and start being a strategist? I don't know if those two things were ever separate. That's what I keep turning over. And the honest answer, the answer I've had to sit with since that room, is that I don't know if those two things were ever separate for him or for me. We built a company together. We built a governance structure together. We sat in meetings together and voted on agendas and signed the same documents and called it a marriage. Maybe the line between building a governance structure and treating it as a weapon was always thinner than I wanted it to be. I won the paper trail. I kept the founder shares in place. The structure he tried to relocate is exactly where it was at 9/11 on a Tuesday morning, before any of this began. And I have no idea what to do with the version of the 9 years that the paper trail just showed me.
Seraphine came back about 10 minutes later. She didn't knock. She opened the door, looked at me still at the table, and didn't say anything for a moment. That's one of the things I've learned about her in 9 years of occasional calls. She doesn't fill silence to be comfortable. She waits until she has something worth saying. She walked to her side of the table. She didn't sit. She looked at the documents still in sequence. Nobody had cleared them, and I hadn't moved them. And then she looked at me. The flag holds. The investor gets nothing. You kept the structure. I know, I said. She waited. She was giving me something, a space to say whatever came after I know. I used it. I just keep thinking about what the 11 days mean. Seraphine looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the documents. She didn't answer. And I understood, watching her not answer, that there was no legal answer to that question. She'd given me everything the law could give.
What the 11 days mean is a different category of thing entirely. It's in the category of things you carry home. I started straightening the documents, not to reorganize them, the sequence was already correct, just to have something to do with my hands. I touched the edge of the investor communication, aligned it with the access log, moved the divorce petition 1 centimeter to the left until its edge matched the transfer request. Then I left the covenant where it was, the tabbed page still visible, the initials in the margin. I had 9 years of doing something with my hands when a meeting ended, writing, organizing, moving papers into order. The habit doesn't know the meeting is over. The habit doesn't know what meeting this was. Seraphine picked up her folio. She said, "The formal rejection goes to Crispin's counsel by end of business. The court will have the record. The divorce proceeds on its own timeline from here." She said it the way she says anything procedural, cleanly, completely, without editorializing. Then, "Call me when you're ready to talk about the next steps." She left again. The door closed. I looked at the documents on the table, the sequence still there, the 11 days at the far left, the 6 minutes in the middle, the covenant at the bottom. The paper trail shows what happened. It doesn't show when he stopped being my husband. Those are 2 different documents. Only one of them exists. I picked up my folder, my copies, the ones Seraphine had prepared for me, and I stood up. My chair pushed back on the floor. The sound of it in that room was very specific, the sound of finishing. The lobby of Seraphine's building is marble. That's the first thing I noticed walking through it on the way in that morning. The specific sound of good shoes on good stone. I noticed it again walking out. Everything about how I looked was the same. Same blazer, same shoes, same earrings I'd put on before 9 a.m. when I was still a woman who didn't know she was about to spend 2 days building a case. I had my bag, my folder of copies, my phone. The security desk nodded as I passed. The glass doors opened. Outside, gray afternoon. The specific light of a city on a weekday when something enormous has just been quietly resolved. Not dark, not dramatic, just gray. The way things look after. I stood on the pavement for a moment. Not because I was deciding anything, because I was letting the building get behind me. Then I took out my phone. I didn't call anyone. I looked at the notifications still there from that morning. The divorce petition, time-stamped 9/12. Then below it, the compliance alert, the transfer request, time-stamped 9/18. 6 minutes, the gap that started everything. I looked at both of them one more time. The transfer didn't go through. The shares are where they were at 9/11 that morning, before the first timestamp, before any of it. The founder share certificate is exactly where it was. The company held. I stopped something real. That's true, and it's also the smallest part of what happened. I put my phone in my bag. Here's what I know now that I didn't know at 9/12. The paper trail is always more honest than the people who leave it. Crispin left a very precise paper trail. So did I. In what I asked for, in what I requested, in the draft timestamp I hadn't thought to pull until Seraphine asked for it. Both of us left a record. His record caught him. Mine caught him faster. What the paper trail doesn't record is the marriage. It records the transfer, the filing, the communications, the covenant, the initials and the margin. It records governance. It cannot record the dinner 10 days before he filed when I thought it was a good evening. It cannot record the 9 years. It cannot record when he made the decision I didn't know he'd made. I won the clock. I just found out what the clock was actually measuring. I started walking. The city moved around me the way cities do, without interest, without pause, without knowing that something enormous had just ended on the floor of a legal building 3 blocks back. I didn't look at the building behind me. There was nothing in that direction that I hadn't already read. The shares didn't move. the company is intact, and I'm walking through a city on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a question that has no document to answer it. That's most of what winning looks like. The next morning, I was back at my desk. My office, the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city at height. The dark walnut surface, that was the first thing in this story I put my hands flat on. The compliance terminal was on. I hadn't turned it off when I left yesterday morning. It had been running all day and all night, logging whatever the systems log, doing what systems do when no one is watching them. The transfer request entry was still there. The status had updated overnight. Rejected. Bad faith determination. Clean, final, institutional. The system had spoken in exactly the language systems use when they've closed something. I want to tell you something about the 6-minute gap, the thing I've understood now that I couldn't see when I was inside it. The 6 minutes were never the story. They were the last 6 minutes of 11 days of planning. They were the visible surface of something much longer and much more deliberate. He thought the gap between 9:12 and 9:18 was the clock that mattered. It wasn't. The clock that mattered started 11 days earlier in a holding entity that was already structured to receive what he was planning to give it. The transfer request was filed at 9:18. That's what I saw first. That's what the compliance flag showed. And that's what I almost let be the whole story. I didn't let it be the whole story because Seraphine asked for the draft timestamp. That's the thing I keep coming back to, not what the logs showed. That I was ready for. What I keep coming back to is I had been looking at the wrong clock. For 36 hours before that call, I had been working the 6-minute gap as if the 6-minute gap was the question. Seraphine heard the same information I gave her and immediately asked for an earlier timestamp I hadn't pulled. The paper trail always knows. The question is whether you're ready to read it. I was ready. I just wasn't the first one in the room who knew which document to ask for. That's the part I'm carrying forward, not the loss, the lesson. He filed for divorce at 9:12. The transfer request was already written. The buyer was already waiting. The gap he thought was his, the window between the filing and the restraints activation, had closed before he submitted anything. The shares didn't move. The company held. And somewhere in a filing system, a divorce is proceeding on its own timeline, separate from the governance structure it was designed to dismantle. 9 years. That's how long the marriage lasted. The company is older than the marriage. It will outlast the divorce. That's what he was trying to move. That's what I kept. I don't know when he stopped being my husband. I don't know if the plan preceded the decision or the decision preceded the plan. The documents don't tell me that. They tell me what he did and when he did it. Everything else, that's the part that lives outside the record.
This is American Billionaire Tales, where fortune meets fate. Some clocks run for years before anyone thinks to read them. Next time, a woman expected her divorce settlement to be fair. Then the company valuation report arrived, and that's when she realized someone had already made her half look smaller than it really was.